China's threshold crossing and the American response that demonstrated the clarity of American commitment and capability removed the ambiguity that had made fence-sitting politically viable. Japan, which had already undertaken the most significant restructuring of its defense posture since the Second World War under the 2022 National Security Strategy that authorized a doubling of defense spending to 2% of GDP and the development of counterstrike capability, responded to the threshold crossing with an announcement that it was accelerating the deployment of Type 12 surface-to-ship missiles to the Ryukyu Islands, the island chain that runs from Kyushu to within 110 kilometers of Taiwan. The acceleration moved the deployment timeline forward by 14 months from the previously scheduled date. Australia, through its defense minister, issued a statement that described China's action as inconsistent with the rules-based international order and announced the acceleration of the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine pathway. Specifically, the confirmation that the first rotational deployment of American Virginia-class submarines to HMS Sterling near Perth, Western Australia, would begin ahead of the previously announced schedule. South Korea, whose threat calculus has historically been dominated by North Korea to the exclusion of the broader Indo-Pacific competition, made a quiet but significant decision in the days following the threshold crossing. Its Defense Acquisition Program Administration approved the accelerated procurement of an additional 20 F-35B short takeoff and vertical landing aircraft, a capability that is relevant not to the Korean Peninsula threat environment, but to power projection operations in the broader maritime domain. One threshold crossing, one calibrated response, 4 allied nations accelerating defense commitments that China's strategy had specifically been designed to prevent or delay. This is the strategic consequence that Beijing's internal planning had most poorly modeled. Not the American military response, which was within the range of outcomes China had gamed, the Allied response, which was amplified rather than dampened by the American response's precision and clarity. China's gray zone strategy depended on maintaining enough ambiguity about American commitment and capability that American allies would hedge rather than align. The response on that Thursday morning eliminated the ambiguity, and allies who had been hedging chose sides. Now, look at the Taiwan dimension, because it is impossible to analyze any Chinese military action in the Western Pacific without understanding its relationship to the Taiwan question, which is, in the final analysis, the reason the entire competition exists. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense, which monitors every significant military movement in the Western Pacific with the focused attention of an entity whose existence is the central stake of the competition, received the American intelligence briefing simultaneously with Manila. Taiwan's response was immediate and multidimensional. The activation of its Xiongfeng III anti-ship missile batteries on the eastern coast of Taiwan, a defensive deployment that had been planned but not executed pending a trigger event, was ordered within 6 hours. The activation put approximately 240 additional anti-ship missiles in operational status, covering the approaches through the Luzon Strait that any Chinese amphibious operation would need to transit. Taiwan also activated a specific civil defense protocol, not publicly announced, not covered by domestic media, but detectable through the observable indicators that defense analysts monitor, that prepositioned emergency response resources in the western coastal cities most exposed to any cross-strait military action. The protocol is one step below the full civil defense mobilization that Taiwan reserves for a genuinely imminent threat assessment. Its activation reflects a judgment by Taiwan's security establishment that the threshold crossing and its aftermath represent a qualitative change in the immediacy of the threat environment. China's action was intended, in part, to demonstrate to Taiwan that American security guarantees are unreliable, that American political will would not sustain the commitment to Taiwan's defense when confronted with Chinese military capability. What the American response demonstrated was precisely the opposite. American commitment expressed not through political statements, but through military positioning, intelligence capability, and the mobilization of an allied network that Taiwan's own defense depends on. Every one of those allied responses, Manila, Tokyo, Canberra, Seoul, is a component of the defensive architecture around Taiwan that makes Chinese military action more costly and less certain of success. There is one final dimension that is the most consequential of all, and it operates inside China itself. The People's Liberation Army's relationship with the Communist Party and the Communist Party's relationship with the Chinese public on matters of military prestige is built on a narrative of continuous competence and steady progress toward the restoration of Chinese greatness. The state media apparatus that manages public perception of military affairs in China is extraordinarily sophisticated and extraordinarily effective at maintaining the narrative of a military that is closing the gap with American capability on every metric, moving toward the strategic environment the CCP has promised its population. That narrative requires operational success, or at minimum the appearance of operational success. A threshold crossing that was intended to demonstrate Chinese military confidence and operational freedom in China's own strategic backyard. followed by an American response that demonstrated American surveillance penetration of Chinese military planning, the repositioning of a carrier strike group that China's surveillance had failed to track, and the coordinated surfacing of submarines that China's most capable ASW assets had been unable to locate. That sequence of events cannot be easily reconciled with a competence narrative. The removal of the naval commander whose authorization produced the threshold crossing was handled internally and quietly. It produced no public statement, no official acknowledgement, no explanation to the Chinese public of why a senior officer had departed his position. But within China's military community, the officers, the analysts, the defense industry personnel, the War College faculty who study American capabilities with professional intensity, the event and its context are not obscure. They are discussed. And the conclusions drawn from the discussion are not the conclusions that serve the CCP's management of military prestige. The internal assessment produced by the PLA's Strategic Support Force, the branch responsible for space, cyber, and intelligence operations, in the weeks following the threshold crossing, according to reporting by the Nikkei Asia based on sources in multiple regional intelligence services, concluded that American intelligence penetration of PLA operational communications was more extensive than previously assessed, and that the technical countermeasures deployed had not achieved the suppression of American collection that they were designed to produce. That assessment, circulating among PLA officers who have staked their careers and their institution's prestige on the proposition that China's military development is producing genuine strategic parity, is corrosive in a way that external pressure cannot produce. External pressure generates nationalist cohesion. Internal evidence of capability gaps generates something else, institutional doubt. Doubt about the accuracy of the internal assessments that drive planning. Doubt about the reliability of the technical systems on which operational confidence is based. Doubt about whether the capability narrative that the PLA has presented to its own leadership accurately reflects the operational reality. Xi Jinping has staked more personal political capital on the PLA's modernization and the trajectory toward Taiwan reunification than any Chinese leader since Mao. The internal institutional doubt that the threshold crossing's aftermath has generated does not threaten his leadership. The CCP's political control is too comprehensive and too deeply institutionalized for a single military embarrassment to produce the kind of political crisis that democratic systems experience. But it introduces a variable into the Taiwan timeline that Beijing's planning had not accounted for. The possibility that the military instrument on which the timeline depends is less ready in specific critical respects than its leadership has been told. A senior European diplomat, speaking on background to the Financial Times 3 weeks after the threshold crossing, described the mood in Beijing's strategic community in terms, I will carefully paraphrase, they are not deterred from their long-term objectives. They are recalculating the timeline and the methodology. And recalculation, when it follows a demonstration of adversary capability that exceeded expectations, is not the same as continuing on the previous course. China crossed the red line. What Beijing did not fully account for was the speed at which the United States, having identified the trend, would move to reverse it, and it did not account for a specific intelligence capability, one that had been developed over 15 years of sustained investment and operational refinement that gave American commanders a picture of Chinese military operations that Beijing believed it had successfully denied. The Thursday morning crossing was not, from China's internal planning perspective, as aggressive as it appeared from the outside. It was the next step in a measured expansion of what Beijing calls its normal operational presence in areas it considers its legitimate sphere. It was supported by an internal legal argument constructed by China's military legal directorate that the specific action taken was consistent with China's interpretation of international maritime law. It was executed with assets that had been prepositioned over a period of weeks in a manner designed to appear routine. It was not routine. And the American response demonstrated, in terms that left no room for alternative interpretation, that the United States had been watching every step of the prepositioning with full clarity and had been ready before China moved. Now let me show you the geography, because in the Pacific, geography is strategy and strategy is geography, and the location China chose for its crossing was selected for reasons that make the American response even more significant. The Western Pacific is not a uniform strategic space. It is a system of island chains that military planners on both sides treat as the fundamental geographic architecture of the competition. The first island chain, running from Japan through the Ryukyu Islands, through Taiwan, through the Philippines to Borneo, is the inner boundary. The second island chain, running from Japan through the Mariana Islands, including Guam, through Micronesia, is the outer boundary. Between these two chains lies the operating space that American forward-deployed forces have used to project power into the Western Pacific for 80 years. China's strategic objective is to move the effective boundary of its military control progressively outward through these chains. Not through invasion or conquest in the conventional sense. Through the establishment of an operational environment within the first island chain so hostile to American naval operations, saturated with anti-ship missiles, anti-submarine warfare assets, electronic warfare systems, and air defense coverage, that American carriers would be forced to operate outside the first island chain, degrading their effectiveness in any Taiwan scenario by the time and distance required to launch and recover aircraft from beyond the defensive bubble China is building. The action China took on that Thursday morning was the most aggressive single step yet taken in the implementation of this strategy. It involved the coordinated movement of assets, naval vessels, maritime militia craft, Coast Guard cutters, and submarine-launched sensor arrays, into a specific area that the United States has explicitly and repeatedly, in classified and semi-classified communications with Chinese counterparts, identified as a threshold action. Not a red line in the colloquial sense of a public ultimatum. A red line in the operational sense of an action that triggers a pre-planned response regardless of the diplomatic context at the moment it occurs. China assessed, based on its analysis of American political constraints, congressional debate about the defense budget, and what it read as ambiguity in recent American statements about Taiwan, that the response to crossing this threshold would be managed through diplomatic channels rather than military ones. That assessment was informed by its understanding of American risk tolerance, American political dynamics, and the historical pattern of American responses to Chinese gray zone provocations, which had consistently been calibrated to avoid escalation. That assessment was wrong. And what made it wrong was not primarily a change in American political will, though that was a factor. What made it wrong was a specific American capability that China had not fully credited. Let me give you the numbers, because in this case the numbers reveal the operational picture more clearly than any general description. The American response began 11 minutes after China's coordinated asset movement reached the threshold configuration. Not 11 hours, not 11 days as the diplomatic process churned through its standard timeline. 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, the following occurred simultaneously across 5 separate operational domains. In the maritime domain, the USS Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group, which China's own surveillance assets had assessed as operating approximately 340 kilometers east of the threshold area, a position that China's planners had calculated was too far for rapid response, was already inside its optimal engagement range. The strike group had not moved at 11 minutes' notice. It had been quietly repositioned over the preceding 72 hours into a location that China's surveillance did not detect, because the repositioning was conducted using a combination of emission control procedures, all non-essential electronics secured, and a routing that used the acoustic shadow of a seamount chain to mask the acoustic signature of the surface group from the submarine-launched sensor arrays China had deployed precisely to monitor American carrier movements. China's surveillance picture showed the Theodore Roosevelt 340 kilometers away. The Theodore Roosevelt was 90 kilometers away, and it had been 90 kilometers away for 31 hours before China moved. In the air domain, within 19 minutes of China's threshold crossing, FA-18 Super Hornets from the Roosevelt were airborne and established in a combat air patrol position that placed them between the Chinese asset formation and the nearest Philippine territorial waters. They were accompanied by an EA-18G Growler that immediately began a systematic electronic survey of every active emission source in the Chinese formation, cataloging, characterizing, and in selected cases actively engaging with the communication links between Chinese vessels in a manner that Chinese operators experienced as unexplained equipment malfunctions, rather than deliberate interference. In the submarine domain, which is where the response achieved its most significant effect, 2 Virginia-class attack submarines that Chinese anti-submarine warfare assets had been unable to locate surfaced simultaneously in positions that bracketed the Chinese formation. Not to threaten, not to engage, to be seen, the deliberate coordinated surfacing of 2 submarines, whose presence had been completely invisible to China's most capable ASW assets for an extended period, communicated a specific operational message with a precision that no diplomatic note could match. We have been here, watching you, and you never knew. In the space domain, the United States Space Force declassified, selectively and deliberately through a briefing to partner nation defense ministries that was designed to reach Beijing through Allied intelligence channels within hours, a set of imagery products demonstrating that American space-based reconnaissance had captured the pre-positioning activity that preceded China's threshold crossing with sufficient resolution and temporal coverage to reconstruct the planning timeline. The message was not simply that America had seen what China did. The message was that America had seen China planning what it did at a level of detail that required intelligence access to China's internal military communication architecture. And in the information domain, something happened that has received almost no coverage in Western media, but which analysts who focus on Chinese military affairs have described as potentially the most consequential element of the entire response. Within 6 hours of China's threshold crossing, a selection of internal Chinese military communications, not their content, but their metadata, their routing architecture, their technical signatures, was shared with the People's Liberation Army through a channel that both sides maintained for exactly this kind of strategic communication. The shared material demonstrated, without requiring any explicit statement, that American signals intelligence collection against Chinese military communications was operating at a level that China's counterintelligence and communication security programs had failed to suppress. Beijing received the message, understood the message, and the specific Chinese naval commander who had authorized the threshold crossing was removed from his position within 4 days. Not publicly, not with any official announcement, but in a manner that the Defense Intelligence Agency's China monitoring apparatus detected through the standard indicators that accompany personnel changes at that level of the PLA's command hierarchy. The response was not a weapons demonstration. It was an intelligence demonstration. And intelligence demonstrations, to military professionals who understand what they mean, are more frightening than any weapon system. Now, a serious counterargument deserves a serious answer. The argument that critics of the American response have made, and it is a legitimate argument that serious analysts are advancing, goes like this. By responding with such visible intelligence capability demonstration, the United States has told China exactly what it knows and, by implication, something about how it knows it. China will now accelerate its efforts to close the intelligence gaps that the response revealed. The commander who was removed will be replaced by someone who knows the lesson of his predecessor's removal. The communication vulnerabilities that the metadata demonstration revealed will be patched. The submarine tracking failure that the coordinated surfacing exposed will drive investment in more capable ASW assets. Has the American response, for all its immediate effectiveness, actually accelerated the capability competition in directions that ultimately disadvantage the United States? It is a fair question. It reflects a genuine tension in the theory and practice of strategic deterrence that has been debated in the relevant community for decades. The answer requires understanding something about the specific logic of intelligence-based deterrence that distinguishes it from weapons-based deterrence. Weapons-based deterrence works through the threat of physical destruction. It is relatively stable once both sides have sufficient capability. The logic of mutually assured destruction that defined the Cold War nuclear balance. But weapons-based deterrence is also observable. Both sides can see each other's weapons. Both sides can model each other's capabilities with reasonable accuracy. The deterrence calculation is made on the basis of information that is largely shared. Intelligence-based deterrence works differently. Its power comes precisely from the uncertainty it creates in the adversary's mind about what is known and what is not known. The adversary, who knows that his adversary has penetrated his communications, cannot know which communications have been read, which operations have been compromised, which secrets are still secret and which have already been collected. That uncertainty is paralyzing in a way that a known weapons capability is not, because it infects every planning process, every operational decision, every communication with the question, are they reading this? When the United States demonstrated its intelligence penetration of Chinese military communications through the metadata sharing, it did not reveal what it knows. It revealed that it knows. The distinction is strategically fundamental. China now has to assume that any communication it cannot be certain is secure may have been compromised. And in a military planning environment, the impossibility of being certain about what is secure drives either a paralysis of operational security, everything goes dark, which produces its own operational problems, or an acceptance of operating under surveillance, which is a form of deterrence more durable than any missile battery. Furthermore, the specific intelligence capability that was demonstrated, the ability to track Chinese military planning through its prepositioning activity weeks before an operation executes, cannot be easily closed, because it does not rely on a single technical vulnerability. It relies on a network of collection methods, space-based imagery, signals intelligence, human intelligence through partner services, and undersea sensor systems whose physical location China cannot easily determine, that would need to be defeated, simultaneously and completely, to restore the denied picture. China cannot simply patch a software vulnerability or change a communication protocol to close this gap. The gap is structural. The response was calibrated, not reactive. And the distinction between those two things tells you everything about who was in control of the escalation dynamic from the moment China's assets began moving. But the story does not end with the immediate confrontation, because the 72 hours that followed China's threshold crossing and the American response produced consequences that extend across every dimension of the Indo-Pacific strategic competition, and several of those consequences are already reshaping the regional environment in ways that Beijing's original calculation had specifically sought to prevent. Begin with the alliance dimension, because this is where the American response achieved its most durable strategic effect. The Philippines, which has been navigating an increasingly uncomfortable position between its treaty ally, the United States, and its economic partner, China, received a detailed classified briefing from the American Pacific Fleet commander within 18 hours of the threshold crossing. The briefing included the intelligence materials demonstrating the pre-positioning timeline, materials that showed, with specificity, that China's coordinated movement had been planned with a deliberateness and a geographic targeting that made its implications for Philippine territorial waters and the Philippines' own maritime claims impossible to misread. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., whose government had been attempting to maintain a degree of strategic ambiguity in the U.S.-China competition, emerged from that briefing and within 48 hours announced an acceleration of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement implementation. Specifically, the activation of 4 additional EDCA sites that had been in negotiation for 18 months without resolution. 3 of those sites are in northern Luzon, directly across the Luzon Strait from Taiwan. One is on Palawan Island, positioned to provide surveillance coverage of the South China Sea approaches that China has been systematically attempting to control. The Philippines made a choice. The intelligence briefing provided the domestic political justification for a choice that the Marcos administration had been reluctant to make publicly under normal conditions. There is a line in the Western Pacific that every Chinese admiral knows exists, that every American Pacific Fleet commander has been authorized to enforce, and that both sides have spent 30 years carefully avoiding the moment of its crossing. On a Thursday mornings that the Pentagon has not officially commented on, and the People's Liberation Army Navy has publicly denied, China crossed it, not by accident. Not through miscalculation, not through the kind of ambiguous maritime encounter that both sides have learned to manage through back-channel communication and carefully choreographed de-escalation. China crossed it deliberately with prepositioned assets, in a configuration that left no room for the interpretation of innocent intent, in a location chosen specifically because it sits at the geographic heart of the strategic competition that will define the 21st century. The response from the United States was not a diplomatic protest note. It was not a strongly worded statement from the State Department spokesperson. It was not a request for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council where China holds a veto. The response was a demonstration of military capability so precise, so layered, and so deliberately calibrated to communicate a specific message to Beijing's military leadership that 3 separate senior officials in the People's Liberation Army, men who have spent their careers building the force that China believes can challenge American primacy in the Pacific, described it to their own internal assessments in terms that Chinese military culture almost never uses about an adversary. They called it shocking. Not the weapons, not the numbers, not even the speed of the response, though the speed was extraordinary. What shocked the PLA's most senior operational commanders was the revelation that the United States knew things about China's military disposition, communication architecture, and operational planning that China believed it had successfully concealed. Things that could only be known if American intelligence penetration of China's military network was operating at a level that Beijing's own counterintelligence apparatus had never detected. China crossed America's red line, and America's response revealed something far more consequential than any weapon system. Stay with me. Because what happened in the Western Pacific in those 72 hours is the most important strategic event of the past decade, and almost nobody outside the relevant classified briefing rooms knows the full picture of what it means. To understand what China did and why the response was structured the way it was, you first need to understand the 30-year strategic competition that produced the moment, and why Beijing's calculation, while ultimately miscalculated, was not irrational. China's relationship with the concept of American military primacy in the Pacific is not simply a matter of national pride, though it is partly that. It is a matter of survival arithmetic that runs through the center of the Chinese Communist Party's foundational legitimacy claim to its own population. The CCP's bargain with the Chinese people is not democracy. It is not personal freedom in the Western sense. The bargain is prosperity, national dignity, and the restoration of what Chinese historical memory calls the century of humiliation, the period from the First Opium War in 1839 through the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, during which China was carved apart by foreign powers, its sovereignty violated, its territory occupied, its people subjected to the kind of humiliation that a civilization with thousands of years of continuous self-understanding as the center of the world found almost incomprehensible. The American military presence in the Western Pacific, the carrier strike groups, the forward deployed forces in Japan and South Korea and Guam, the alliance relationships with Taiwan and the Philippines and Australia, is not, from Beijing's perspective, a stabilizing force. It is the contemporary institutional expression of the same dynamic that produced the century of humiliation. A foreign power projecting military force into what China understands as its own strategic backyard, with a demonstrated willingness and ability to intervene in China's internal affairs, specifically the Taiwan question, that Beijing regards as the last unresolved wound of the humiliation era. Every Chinese military investment since 1996, when the United States sailed 2 carrier strike groups through the Taiwan Strait in response to Chinese missile tests, and Beijing could do nothing but watch, has been organized around a single strategic objective: make the cost of American military intervention in the Western Pacific high enough that Washington concludes the price of maintaining primacy exceeds its value. The DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles, the carrier killers, the J-20 fifth-generation fighter, the Type 0055 destroyer, the most capable surface combatant China has ever built, the submarine expansion program, the artificial island fortifications in the South China Sea, the development of hypersonic glide vehicles, the anti-satellite weapons designed to blind American space-based reconnaissance and communications, all of it organized around a single strategic theory: that a military powerful enough to make American intervention too costly, combined with an economic relationship deep enough to make American intervention too expensive, would eventually produce a Western Pacific in which China's preferences were the default rather than the exception. For 20 years, that strategy made steady, measurable progress. The cost calculus shifted. American war games about Taiwan scenarios became less optimistic. The 2018 National Defense Strategy explicitly identified China as the pacing threat, the adversary against whose capabilities American defense investment would be benchmarked. The 2022 National Security Strategy described the decade ahead as decisive in determining whether American primacy in the Indo-Pacific would be maintained or supplanted. Beijing read all of it, analyzed all of it, and concluded, based on its own internal modeling, that the trend line was favorable. That time was working in China's direction, that patience and steady capability development would eventually produce the strategic environment that the CCP's founding purpose required. America's response was so precise, so comprehensive, and so revealing of the depth of American capability that the crossing produced the opposite of its intended strategic effect. Not a demonstration of Chinese confidence, a demonstration of Chinese exposure. Let me take you back to where we started. That Thursday morning, that line in the Western Pacific that both sides had spent 30 years carefully avoiding. China's decision to cross it was not impulsive. It was the product of years of strategic calculation, internal modeling, and a reading of the American political environment that seemed, from inside Beijing's planning apparatus, to support the conclusion that the moment had come. That American political will was insufficient. That American capability, while formidable, was operating at a remove from the specific geography that China was contesting. That the response would be diplomatic, manageable, and ultimately productive of the narrative that China's military was operating with confidence in its own strategic backyard. Every one of those conclusions was wrong. American political will was expressed not through statements, but through a carrier strike group that had been quietly repositioned into engagement range 31 hours before China moved. American capability was expressed not through weapons, but through the circular revelation of intelligence penetration that China's own counterintelligence apparatus had failed to detect. The response was not diplomatic and manageable. It was military, precise, and revelatory in ways that removed the ambiguity on which China's gray zone strategy depended. And in the 72 hours that followed, 4 allied nations made decisions that collectively moved the strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific in a direction that is measurably less favorable to Chinese objectives than it was before Thursday morning. China crossed America's red line. The response was not a punishment. It was a revelation of capability, of positioning, of allied cohesion, and of intelligence penetration so comprehensive that the PLA is still working through the implications of what it means for every operational plan it has developed in the past decade. The Pacific is not a place where the competition is over. The competition is generational, and its decisive chapters have not yet been written. But the chapter written on that Thursday morning and in the 72 hours that followed will be studied in war colleges on both sides of the Pacific for decades. China crossed the line. America's response left them speechless, not because of what it destroyed, because of what it revealed. Thank you for watching. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening in the Western Pacific, beyond the headlines and the official statements and the diplomatic communiques, please like this video and share it. Because the strategic competition that will shape the 21st century deserves to be understood with clarity and honesty by as many people as possible. At TGN, we will continue to follow the balance of power as it shifts in real time, because understanding it is the first step toward navigating it.